Hello and welcome to Pocket-Sized Apologetics. I am Ken Coughlin. Thank you very much for joining us here this lovely Friday afternoon at 12 noon. I say lovely very loosely. For those of you that are here in the Maryland area, you'll know it's rainy and wet and gloomy and yucky. So what better day to be sitting inside watching on your phone, computer, TV, or whatever, and doing a little bit of studying and exercising your brain muscles. If you are watching us live, then please feel free, if you have any questions today, to go ahead and put them in the live chat. I do have that running right here, so I can try to answer those for you on the air. If you are not watching this live, then go ahead and comment below, and I'll try to monitor those and answer any questions as they come up. So anyway, hey, for those of you just joining us for the first time this week, we're actually kind of in the middle of a study on what's called the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, we'll go into that specifically, what that is in just a second, and I'll try to catch you up for those of you that haven't seen the last two episodes to kind of bring you up to speed to where we're at today. But obviously, the best thing to do would be to go back and watch those to completely bring yourself up to speed. But I want to make one quick sales pitch real quick, and that's to let you know something else we have coming up here on the channel next week. For those of you that are familiar, some of you may not be, with this little tome right here. This is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, what a lot of people say is kind of after the Bible, the next book every Christian should read. I kind of agree with that, actually. I don't agree with everything Lewis says in this book, but it is a great book, kind of a primer on the Christian faith. Well, we are actually going to be doing a free online study of this book on Wednesday night, starting this coming Wednesday at 7 o'clock p.m. right here on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel from 7 to 8:30 for 6 weeks. So keep an eye on the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel so you'll get notifications of that. But put that on your calendar. Plan on joining us right here on the same channel that you're watching this show on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, 7 to 8:30. And don't worry, if you are fans of The Masked Singer, you can watch it on the Fox Now app or on demand after the fact. Matter of fact, if you have the Fox Now app, it lets you watch it from the beginning, even if it's still going on. So even though we run until 8:30, all right, you can, at 8:30, you can leave our study and you can go and start watching Masked Singer from the beginning. You don't have to start at the middle, midway through. Don't miss anything. Just don't get on the internet so you don't find out what the results were, obviously, while it's going on. So Masked Singer is not an excuse for not joining us. Just want to say that. All right, so we were talking about the moral argument for the existence of God. And so what I want to do real quick right now, well, actually, before we get into that, I'm going to respond to something. When I was posting the links in various different groups here at about half an hour ago before this started, just to let people know about the program and to tune in, there was a gentleman in one of the groups, an atheist gentleman, who I'm not going to say what his screen name was, but suffice it to say, it clearly was not his real name, who commented on it. And when I said that we're going to be talking about the moral argument for the existence of God, and he said something along the lines of, how about, let me know when you can point out any scientific evidence that points to God. And I did respond to him, and I basically said, hey, actually, look through this is episode, what are we on, like 80-something right now? It's like, look through some of the earlier episodes of this program, because we've done exactly that. And there's quite a few that I said I'd invite you to go through and peruse them if you're really interested. I mean, if you're really raising that objection as a sincere obstacle between you and the faith, and not just because it's something you've heard over and over again and you want to, have a gotcha moment, and then go back and look through it, because there's plenty of scientific evidence that points to God. I mean, Romans 1:20 tells us that because God created everything, there's going to be evidence of him in his creation. But leaving that aside, I always get kind of amusement, maybe I shouldn't, when people say things like that, because it shows this idea that there is some kind of inherent conflict between science and faith. Not only just shows a lack of understanding of both science and faith and all those things that I talked about in the earlier episodes, but it just shows a complete lack of understanding of history. I mean, if you look back to people like Copernicus and Kepler, people whose scientific discoveries nobody's going to dispute the significance of, the heliocentric universe for Copernicus, and Kepler talking about the elliptical orbits of the planets and discovering the elliptical orbits of the planets. If you look back at their discoveries, you know what you find out? They were actually motivated by their faith. It was their faith that not just drove them to make these discoveries and make the investigation, but actually pointed them in the right direction. For example, when Copernicus was looking at the prevailing thought model of the functioning of the universe and the geocentric universe right now, and everything that was required to go into that in order for it to even remotely start to make sense, he said it was sloppy. It was incredibly sloppy, and one of his primary objection to it was God isn't sloppy. And if God created this universe, that it's going to be neater than that and simpler than that. And so he used that as his motivating factor to go on and look into the other possibilities, discovered what he could about, and has obviously been built upon by Galileo and everything after that as well, of the heliocentric universe. And so historically speaking, faith and science have not been at odds with each other. As a matter of fact, they've been very complementary of each other when properly understood and kept in proper perspective. So anyway, that's not the subject for today's episode. So just a side note, because somebody did make a comment, I thought I'd address it here on the air. But I'm not monitoring Facebook anymore. Obviously, I'm live. So if you do have any more comments about anything, again, please put them in the live chat, because that I will be able to see and we'll be able to talk about as we go through. All right, now getting on to what our actual subject today is supposed to be, the moral argument for the existence of God. Quick refresher course to bring us up to speed over what we've talked about over the last 2 weeks. First of all, what is the moral argument for the existence of God? And it's this. The moral argument says, and I broke it down to two premises and a conclusion here. Premise one, if a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. And the conclusion, therefore, a personal God exists. Now, what we've done, again, over the past several weeks, is we've talked about what the difference is, what we mean by moral values and duties. We've talked about objective versus subjective. And specifically, what we did here in week one, or 2 episodes ago, we took a close look at premise one. And what we showed then was that God can do what we call ground or explain, be the foundation, the basis for objective moral values and duties. So if these things called objective moral values and duties actually do exist, then God can explain them. All right? And then what we did in the next week, last week, is we took a look at premise 2, where it says objective moral values and duties do exist, and we asked, does morality have to be objective or can it be subjective? And I'll give you a quick refresher on what that means here in a second. And we concluded that no, it can't be subjective. Morality does have to be objective, supporting premise 2. So what we're going to do this week is we're going to take a look back at premise 1 for a second, because notice what premise 1 actually says. It says essentially that God is the only explanation for objective moral values and duties. Not just that he is an explanation, one possible explanation, but he's the only one. And so we want to take a look at that, because while I did 2 episodes ago defend the proposition that God is an explanation, one possible explanation for objective moral values and duties, I haven't yet looked at any other explanations that have been offered to see if they also can explain the existence of objective moral values and duties. And so in the time that we have here today, we're going to try to take a look at some of those and some of the more common explanations that are thrown out there to see if they actually hold up. So, as a quick reminder of what we mean by objective, and I gave this illustration each of the last 2 episodes. I'll give an abbreviated version today. One person walks up on the street and arbitrarily punches another person, and they get into a disagreement about whether they were morally right or morally wrong to do so. One person says, no, I think I was morally right to hit you. The other one says, no, I think you were morally wrong to hit me. And they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The question is that all there is? Is morality just their 2 different opinions, in which case there's no way for them to ever resolve that dispute? One thinks one thing, the other thinks another thing, and there's no judging between them. Or is there something, what we call transcendent, something above both of them, that they're both subject to, whether they agree with it or not, that says whether who actually is morally right and who actually is morally wrong? And what we talked about in that first episode, we were talking about the moral argument, and what I defended is that God, if God exists, God can be that foundation, that we can have these moral rules that are above us, and God can be the explanation for them. So, that's a real quick overview of where we've been here over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to, again, for better understanding, I'm going to ask you to go back and watch those 2 episodes, but hopefully that gives you enough that you can follow along with what we're doing here today. So what we're doing today is we're looking at what I just talked about. We're looking at this idea that there are objective moral values and objective moral duties. In other words, there is such a thing as right and wrong. There is such a thing as goodness, for example. And we're under an obligation to be good. It's not just that this idea of goodness exists out there, but that we actually have an obligation to behave in a good manner. And we've said that can be grounded in God. That makes sense. If God exists, those things that are above us that we don't have a vote in, they make sense. They could exist. The question is there any other way these objective, transcendent moral values and duties could exist, even without God. All right? And what I want to do today is I'm going to look at three different propositions that have been thrown out there, really kind of two and a half, because the third one is kind of building on one of the ones we'll talk about, and to see if they hold up. And see other attempts, in other words, to ground objective moral values and duties in something other than God, and see what the result has been. And the first one, that's a very common one, is, scroll over here, is from Immanuel Kant. A lot of you probably heard that name. You might not be, even if you're not a philosophy student. I mean, if you watch Jeopardy or enough, his name probably has come up in a few Jeopardy answers. Who is Immanuel Kant? Immanuel Kant, I'm not going to go into a big history lesson. We don't have time for all of that as far as, all these people's backstories. I'm really just going to focus on their ideas today. Immanuel Kant, his moral system is based on what he called the categorical imperative. Now, let me explain that in hopefully layman's terms. All right, what Kant wanted to do, whereas we've said that objective moral values and duties kind of need God to be their source, Kant said, I don't think so. Now, keep in mind, Kant was a firm believer in God. He was a Christian, he was devout, but he developed this system where he said, I think pure reason alone, all right, logic, reason, things like that, can justify morality. We don't need God to justify it. We can do it based on pure reason, all right? Now, in order to understand where he was coming at, you need to understand the distinction between two different things. What he called a hypothetical imperative and what he called a categorical imperative, all right? Now, imagine that you want something, all right? I want mint chocolate chip ice cream, all right? And in my freezer, I currently, this is true actually, we forgot to put it on the shopping list, and I just went grocery shopping. I don't have any mint chocolate chip ice cream in my freezer. All right, so if I don't have mint chocolate chip ice cream, but I want mint chocolate chip ice cream, there is something that I ought to do in order to achieve that goal, isn't there? I need to go to the grocery store, put on my mask, which is over here. I do keep it with me everywhere because you got to have a mask on nowadays when you go into those places. Maintain social distancing, right? And even more so, if you haven't noticed this, at least in Maryland, a lot of places are doing this. You've got one-way markers up the aisles. You're supposed to be going just one direction up and down the aisles, like snake back and forth. So please look out for those and try to obey those as well. So, but you got to go through I got to go through all that. That's what I ought to do. Go to the freezer section, get some mint chocolate chip ice cream, buy it, bring it home, and then I will have mint chocolate chip ice cream. All right? That is what Kant calls a hypothetical imperative. There is something I ought to do, but it's contingent. In other words, the only reason I ought to do that is because I want the ice cream. If I didn't want mint chocolate chip ice cream, then I wouldn't need to do any of that. All right? That's what he means by it being hypothetical. Now, he contrasts this with what he calls the categorical imperative. And what he means by the categorical imperative is he says there's one thing that reason alone dictates, in essence. What he says, every reasonable person, just through the laws of utilizing their reasoning abilities alone, has to agree to this one categorical imperative. So it's not contingent. It's not if we want it to be true, then we ought to do this. It's we have to accept this to be true, therefore we ought to do this. All right, that's what he means by categorical. And while he did explain it in different ways, and I don't have time to go through all the different ways that he formulated it, this is the most common one that you got on the screen right now. And the most well-known way he categorized it, and the first way I believe he categorized it, is we should act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. All right, you got to love reading these old philosophers because needless to say, they don't speak the same way we do nowadays. So let me shed some light on what that means. Okay. In layman's language, all right, essentially what that means, if you are deciding, okay, should I take action A or take action B? What the question you need to ask yourself is, could you abide by, would it be right for there to be a universal moral law? In other words, if you choose to act in manner A, to take action A, what if everybody acted that way? What if everybody did, in your circumstances, faced with your circumstances, act by taking action A? Then what would happen? All right. So, for example, let's say that you still have an old picture tube, 13-inch black and white TV from the 1950s. 13 inches is probably too big for the 1950s, isn't it? Let's say an 8-inch TV or 10-inch TV, and that's the only television that you've got. And you really can't afford to buy one of these brand new flat screen doohickeys, and so you're sitting there in whatever the retail store is, and you look around, you don't see any security cameras, and you don't see any security guards. There's nobody else around. Everybody else is distracted by their social distancing, and so you decide, you know what, I could take this TV and walk out the store, and nobody's going to know. All right, and let's assume that you're reasonably assured that you would get away with it. Now, what Kant would say is, if you're faced with that choice, would it be right? Does it sit well with you? What would happen, in other words, if everyone in that situation followed that same rule, took that same action? All right, everyone faced with the opportunity to steal did steal. Well, what would happen? Obviously, the economy would collapse. People would lose their jobs. The stores would not be able to sell anything because everything would just be getting stolen left and right. It would create chaos, right? And so that's obviously not the action you should take according to Kant's system, because you can't will that it would become, in other words, you can't wish that it would become a universal law. Now, the question then becomes, all right, does Kant's system adequately ground moral value, objective moral values and duties? In other words, can it serve as that basis that transcends us, that's above all of us? And the answer is no. And most philosophers nowadays will agree that the answer is no. It does have some failings. Again, I don't have time to go through everything. It's definitely, I do like Kant. I have several of his books on my own bookshelf. I'm very impressed with him. But it's not to say that his system is without flaws. It does have flaws, and it doesn't satisfy the need we have for that transcendent standard. Excuse me. First of all, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, he calls this a categorical imperative. All right? Why? What is it that makes it categorical? Now, Kant seems to want to say that pure reason alone can point us towards this categorical imperative, towards this thing being universally true, something we all have to accept. But that's not necessarily true, is it? First of all, understand, when you're talking about pure reason, we're talking about the laws of logic, working things through, all right? And any philosopher is going to tell you that any argument, any law, any reasoning process has to have a starting point. And for the pure logical rules alone, you're not going to get anywhere. You've got to have a starting point, which is an assumption, a presupposition, something you're just taking to be true. And then from that, you then apply the laws of logic to it, and you build upon that, following where the laws of logic take you until you reach a conclusion. But your conclusion is still always contingent upon what your starting assumption was. And there's certainly some starting assumptions that are reasonable and some that are not reasonable, some that we're more willing to accept and that we're not willing to accept. But the logical reasoning process always has to have that starting point. All right? And so Kant's problem is from those laws of logic alone, from the reasoning alone, you can never get any categorical imperative. All right, you still need to have some starting point and some starting assumptions in order to get that process moving. Now, what some people will say and what skeptics will say is like, well, but regardless, it's something that everybody agrees upon. All right, it's or that we have to agree upon. At least all reasonable people have to agree upon this, even if maybe the laws of logic. So maybe Kant wasn't quite right when he says reason alone can get us there. It's more of a practical thing where, okay, maybe the laws of logic and reason can't actually get us there, but everybody agrees to it. All right, generally speaking, unless you're wackadoodle, you're going to agree that this is a good idea. The problem is, that's again getting back to what we talked about, I can't remember if it was last episode or 2 episodes ago, the difference between epistemology and ontology, and it's confusing the two. All right, epistemology is that fancy philosophical term that just means how we know or how we come to believe things. All right, whereas ontology is what is actually true. All right, and these aren't the same thing. You've got to remember, what we're talking about with a moral argument is ontology. What is actually true about the source of morality, not what we individually believe. All right, a lot of people believe things that are right and they believe things that are wrong, and you may believe something that's right, but for all the wrong reasons. And the explanation I gave, I think it was last episode, was you may think that human beings perceive the sky as blue. All right, but that's because there's really an ocean of fish and whales and everything suspended above us. All right, and that's what we're actually seeing. Well, you've come to the right ontological belief. The ontological actual truth is human beings do perceive, other than those that are colorblind or blind, obviously, they do perceive the sky as being blue. But it's not because there's some ocean up there. All right, and so there's a difference between how you come to your beliefs and the truth of what you actually believe. in other words. And those who try to defend Kant by saying everybody agrees with this categorical imperative, or at least the vast majority of people agree with this categorical imperative, are missing that distinction. The distinction isn't whether people think this categorical imperative is a good idea. The question is whether it's actually the foundation for morality, and there's a distinction between those two. So that's a quick overview, obviously, of Immanuel Kant and why ultimately it falls into the same problems that some other systems do. He still fails to actually ontologically, again to use that fancy philosophical term, to have a basis for that. We could always look at that categorical imperative and ask, why is that imperative? Why? On what basis do you say that? And there's really no satisfactory answer to that question, which means it fails on this ultimate grounding standard. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is something that is called utilitarianism. All right, utilitarianism is, there's a lot of different views and philosophers that kind of fall under this umbrella. The two most famous ones are those that are on the screen, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. There's different variations of utilitarianism, or some would say the broader category would be consequentialism. But essentially what these types of theories say is that we need to rely upon a calculus of consequences to determine the greater good, all right? And so you're looking at the consequences of an action, and the consequences of the actions will determine whether or not something is morally right or morally wrong, all right? Now, again, some of the different variations with Jeremy Bentham, he was had a very quantitative version of it, where he was just kind of adding up pleasures and pains, and he was what we call, his philosophy was what we call act utilitarianism. In other words, the action itself, for each individual action, you look at what its consequences are going to be, and if the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences, then it's the right thing to do, all right? Or if the pleasure that it brings outweighs the pain that it brings, then it's the right thing to do. All sorts of issues with that. Very few philosophers nowadays are pure act utilitarians, because that basically is the end justifies the means. And it can excuse some actions that I think the vast majority of us today would say are morally abhorrent, simply because they happen to lead into that particular circumstance to a good end. All right. But John Stuart Mill kind of picked up where Jeremy Bentham's foundation, and he built on that, and he had more of a qualitative system where it wasn't just adding up pleasures and pains. He took into account other qualitative positives. It doesn't just have to be a physical pleasure or physical pain. There's things about, beauty. Beauty, for example, has value. Art has value, things like that. And he took that into account, and he established what we now call rule utilitarianism, where it's not necessarily the individual acts, but you use this kind of calculus to develop general rules, general rules of behavior, and those rules are what actually govern us. All right, but here's the problem with utilitarianism, all right? Utilitarianism, no matter what variety you're looking at, all right, it uses as its basis what is good. It basically says if the good things outweigh the bad things, then it's the morally good thing to do. Do you start to see the problem here? It's circular. You ever ask someone, what's a good example? Where you use the term in defining the term. What is this is a bad one, I'm just coming off the top of my head. What's a space explorer? Well, it's someone who explores space. Great, that's helpful, right? I mean, the same thing is happening with utilitarianism when you really boil it down. The whole point that we're trying to do here is we're trying to define what good means. But in their attempted definition of good, they rely upon something being good. Well, how do you know whether the good things outweigh the bad things unless you first know what good means in order to determine which things are good and which things are bad? See, so it's circular. It ends up using the very concept it's trying to define in its definition. And so that's why no matter what variety of utilitarianism you're looking at is going to collapse on those grounds, because and we'll see an example from Sam Harris in a minute where he tries to, use fancy language. In other words, they're not all going to use that word. They're not going to say, well, the good has to outweigh the bad. They're going to say, flourishing or something like that. But ultimately, the reason those goals are considered goals that we should be aiming for achieving is because they're considered good. But that's what we're trying to define in the first place. So it ends up being a circular problem. Another problem with utilitarianism is, remember what we've been talking about, is any moral system has to have both objective moral values, in other words, we need to know what goodness is, and it also has to explain objective moral duties. Just because there's something out there called goodness doesn't mean we're under any obligation to actually be good, to actually behave in that way. So what is it that actually imposes that obligation upon us? For all the criticisms I have of Immanuel Kant, at least he tried to caption his system in terms of imperatives, things that that did include an ought element to them. We ought to do this. Utilitarianism doesn't. It just kind of takes the ought for granted and says, well, we can define what goodness is by if the good results, the good consequences outweigh the bad consequences, but that doesn't mean we should behave that way, even if that were true. Why should we behave that way? Why should we care? All right? So utilitarianism has both of those faults, and many others as well. It's circular, and it also fails to establish an ought, or give us a reason why we should behave in a manner to pursue those particular goals. All right, and the last one I'm going to go over today that I'm going to talk about, let's see here, there we go, is one proposed by Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a modern-day atheist. He likes to get out there and debate. And he published a book called The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values in 2010. And his basic proposition, his general proposition in there, was that science itself can tell us what is morally right and morally wrong. Needless to say, he does not have a lot of good company in that conclusion, and his system has not been adopted by most people. And the reason is, for a long time, philosophers on both sides of the aisle, both atheist and theistic philosophers alike, have kind of agreed, no, science cannot illuminate what is morally right and what is morally wrong. But Sam Harris thinks it can. And what he does, he tries to put a neuroscientific spin on traditional utilitarianism. All right, and what he says is, he tries to say, kind of like Kant actually too, that there's something that we all should need to agree upon, and that is that human well-being, or he kind of goes back and forth sometimes whether he's just humans or the well-being of all sentient creatures. I think in fairness, his belief is probably the well-being of all sentient creatures is the ultimate value. All right, so that is something that, the well-being of sentient creatures is the ultimate value. That's something that we should all be pursuing. So from that one broad premise, we can then derive all other moral values from that. All right, so if it's a good thing to pursue the well-being of all sentient creatures, then we want to know if something else is a good thing. What we ask is, well, is it a subset of that? Is it helping to achieve that overall overarching goal of the well-being of sentient creatures? But again, and so that's essentially, he gets into, it's kind of, really, I classify this as kind of utilitarianism, because he does kind of add up the consequences of the actions to see, whether or not they achieve it, more of them achieve that goal than not. But like you can see, it's kind of an amalgamation of Kant's categorical imperative in that regard and utilitarianism. But he falls under the same problem. He never explains, why is that the objective value? Why is that the supreme value? I mean, you can say it. We can all agree to it. That doesn't mean it's so. I mean, let me give you one other illustration about what I mean by that might help bring it a little bit more into layman's understanding. When I'm saying that just because everybody agrees to something doesn't mean it's true, and that what we're asking here is what's true, not necessarily what everybody thinks. Here's a common example that we apologists like to give. Suppose the Nazis had won World War II, and every single person on the face of the earth ended up believing as they did and adopting that Nazi worldview. Would that have made it right? Just because everybody believes a thing doesn't mean they're right to believe it. All right? And I think most of us sitting here would still say, no, what the Nazis believed in their worldview was downright evil. All right? And so it doesn't matter if one person believes that or every person believes that, it's still evil. All right? And that's the problem that systems like Sam Harris's have, is that they don't take that into account, that even if everybody were agreed with him that the well-being of sentient creatures and the flourishing of sentient creatures is something that should be pursued, that doesn't answer the question we're asking. Why is that the supreme value? How do you ground that? How do you base that? All right, and just adding up the numbers of heads that all agree with you is never going to get you there. It still ends up being a subjective ethic, like we talked about last week, not an objective ethic. Any moral system that ultimately is grounded in what people think is going to be subjective. Because what we're looking for, remember, is something that goes above what people think. That is true regardless of what people think. And all of these systems we've talked about today are trying to do that. They're trying to point something that's higher, but they ultimately fail. Ultimately, they still all boil down to what people think. And so they're all subjective ethical systems. And that falls into all the problems that we talked about last week with subjective ethical systems. So I'd invite you to go back and look at that. All right, so what I want to do here is I'm going to take another quick look back at forgive me, I didn't put the slide at the end, so I got to scroll back to the beginning here, at the moral argument and see what we've covered. All right, so this is the moral argument for the existence of God. If a personal God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. How did I defend that? I talked about the fact that if God is real, all right, then number one, we can ground moral values. In other words, we can define what goodness means by his character. Whether we realize it or not, when we say something is good, what we're saying is that it resembles some character trait of God. All right, that's where the definitions come from. Moral duties, we also said, can also be grounded in God. Why? Because you owe duties to persons, not objects. If you just arbitrarily kick a rock into a flower bed, you haven't committed a moral wrong against the rock. If you arbitrarily kick a person into a flower bed, you have committed a moral wrong against the person. So in order for duties to be grounded, they have to be grounded in a person. There has to be a person to whom we owe moral duties from which all other moral duties can be derived. All right. So if God exists, we can have objective moral values and duties. The next part of that premise I defended today. And I said, let's look at the other options that have been proposed. The other options don't work. They're trying to find some transcendent source, some source above us, but they don't work for one reason or another. And most of the time what we see is they actually end up boiling down to being a subjective system, not an objective system. Now, obviously, this isn't exhaustive. In one episode, I've gone through basically 3 different options, but hopefully at least introduces you to the general idea and the general principles that show why these other ethical systems don't work. All right, so that's premise 1. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist, and this is what I defended last week. We talked about the difference between a subjective ethic and an objective ethic, and we said that even some people, and subjective just ends up being a matter of opinion, and nobody actually believes that. Nobody actually thinks that there's no moral standard above us all. Don't believe me? See how you react if someone steals your wallet. You can say all you want that you think that, they have their opinion, I have my opinion, and really I shouldn't judge them. You know, we shouldn't judge other people's moral opinions. But the fact of the matter is, when you're the one who's the victim, when you're the one who has your wallet stolen, when it's your house that's broken into, you're going to act very differently. You're going to act like they did something actually wrong, not just a matter of personal preference. When someone steals something from you, you're not going to say, they thought it was okay to steal from me. I don't think it's okay for them to steal from me, but really it's their opinion versus mine. So what? You know, there's no difference between the two. That's not how you're going to respond. You're going to act like there actually is something objective above us. And we also talked last week about how some people, some skeptics have tried to say, no, well, yes, we can still have relative ethics or subjective ethics, but it doesn't have to be personal opinion. It's really our culture that determines it. You know, it's the broader culture that we're under that determines what we should morally do and what we shouldn't morally do. So it doesn't have to be on an individual basis, but it's still subjective in that sense, but based on broader culture. And we talked about how that doesn't work either, because none of us are the members of just one culture. We're all members of multiple cultures, subcultures, whatever. And those different cultures that we're all part of, different groups you're part of, are all influencing you and helping shape who you are. All right. And ultimately, because we all have these unique experiences, these unique influences upon us, you can't say, our broader culture is determining what our morality is. Really, which culture? Because there's multiple ones to choose from. Ultimately, every person is still an individual with individual influences, so it all still boils down to an individual subjective ethic. So that's premise 2. We talked about if objective moral values exist, values and duties can exist, God can explain them, other systems can't. We talked about that objective moral values and duties exist because that's the way we all live our lives, that's what we all assume to be true. Well, if those 2 premises are true, then the conclusion naturally follows. Therefore, a personal God exists. All right? So that is the moral argument for the existence of God. If you do have any questions, shoot them in the comments section after this is over, and I'll try to answer them next week's episode. I forgot to check my schedule. I have a calendar worked out for this whole program as far as what we're doing when. I think we're going to wrap up the moral argument here today. I think we've covered pretty much everything on that. And so next week we're going to move on to a new topic, but I don't know what it is because I didn't check my calendar and my schedule. So we'll call next week the surprise pocket-sized apologetics topic. Tune in next week to find out what it is. All right. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate it, and God bless.